In most history textbooks, Sumer is presented as a clear starting point of human civilization, the place where writing appeared, where the first cities were built, and where humans first organized society on a large scale. But what is rarely mentioned is this. The entire picture is assembled from uneven fragments scattered in the mud and soil of southern Mesopotamia and interpreted through the lens of modern science, which is always limited by what has managed to survive. What we call Sumer today is not a complete, intact record of a living civilization. It is a reconstruction built from broken tablets, eroded foundations, and traces preserved by chance rather than intention. Some voices were recorded and endured, while countless others disappeared without leaving a trace, creating long stretches of silence in the historical record. Between what we can still read and what has been lost forever lies a gap that no amount of interpretation can fully close. In this episode of Bedtime History, the purpose is not to deny Sumer, nor to replace history with extreme or speculative theories. Instead, the focus is placed on the evidence that still exists and on the gaps that have formed over many thousands of years. By examining both the surviving data and these silent spaces, we can better understand the limits of the current picture and how those limits shape the way we understand and present the history of Sumer today. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, cities such as Uruk, Eridu, and Ur begin to appear in the archaeological record with a scale and level of organization that place them at the center of human history. It is from this moment that the idea of the first civilization is usually formed. Yet setting this date as a starting point unintentionally creates an illusion. The sense that before Sumer there was only emptiness, a blurred stretch of time in which humans lived sparsely without structure and without any meaningful collective memory. Archaeology over the past century has shown that this assumption no longer holds. Before 3,500 years before the Common Era, Mesopotamia was not a cultural desert. From roughly 9,000 to 7,000 years before the Common Era, early agricultural communities already existed along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Sites such as Jarmo in northern Mesopotamia show that humans domesticated barley and wheat and practiced animal husbandry at a very early stage. These communities were small, but they were stable, intentional, and rooted in place. By around 6,500 years before the Common Era, the Ubaid culture began to spread across southern Mesopotamia. It left behind clear traces of organized life, permanent villages, mud brick houses, storage systems, and communal rituals that point to a shared social framework. What matters most is this. The Ubaid communities did not disappear before Sumer emerged. On the contrary, much of the evidence suggests continuity and transformation rather than collapse. Early temple architecture at Eridu, dated to around 5,400 years before the Common Era, already displays features that continue for millennia, long before Uruk became a major urban center. This continuity raises a fundamental question about how we tell the story of Sumer. If social, economic, and religious structures had existed for such a long time, then what exactly began around 3,500 years before the Common Era? Part of the answer lies in how history is recorded. Cuneiform writing appears around 3,300 to 3,200 years before the Common Era, primarily for economic administration, tracking grain, livestock, and labor. From this point on, the past begins to speak through texts. Everything before that, and no matter how long-lasting or complex, falls silent in the written record. This silence causes the pre-Sumerian periods to be treated as a vague prehistory. Even though they may have contained forms of social organization, we simply lack the data to reconstruct. Archaeology also struggles to capture what does not endure: wooden structures, informal systems of authority, kinship-based exchange networks, and knowledge passed orally across generations. When such elements leave no clear material trace, modern history tends to underestimate their importance. Seen from this perspective, Sumer may not be where everything began, but where things were first recorded clearly enough for us to see them. Its cities, especially Uruk, appear in the data with exceptional scale and density, creating the impression of a sudden transformation. Yet this impression does not necessarily reflect the true pace of change. It reflects the moment when long-running processes became large enough, concentrated enough, and durable enough to be recognized with clarity in the archaeological record. Archaeology depends on the layers of sediment that still survive. Small, scattered settlements built with simple, perishable materials tend to leave far fewer traces than large urban centers that were constructed and rebuilt continuously over many centuries. This creates a structural bias in the data. The more concentrated a society is, the more evidence it leaves behind. The more dispersed and flexible it is, the more easily it disappears from the historical record. For this reason, the rise of Uruk may not reflect a sudden birth of social complexity, but rather the moment when social complexity became heavy enough to press deeply into the ground. In addition, the timelines commonly used to describe the development of Sumer, such as early Uruk or late Uruk, are modern classifications created after the evidence itself had already been fragmented. When archaeologists place different sites into a single chronological framework, they can unintentionally blur slow, uneven processes that unfolded differently from one region to another. One area may have experienced gradual urbanization over many centuries, while another only expanded rapidly after absorbing new economic or technical influences. Viewed as a whole, these varied transformations are compressed into a single period, creating the impression that history suddenly accelerated. Another factor contributing to the illusion of a sudden burst is the appearance of large-scale public building. Temples, centralized storage facilities, and administrative complexes at Uruk are often treated as signs of an organizational system that emerged almost overnight. Yet to build and maintain such structures, a society must have already accumulated long experience in managing labor, distributing resources, and resolving conflict. These skills cannot form within just a few short generations. They point instead to a longer, quieter history, one that unfolded before the first mud brick walls were ever raised. It is also important to note that pre-urban economic models may have looked very different from what we associate with classical cities. Exchange based on kinship ties, ritual obligations, or seasonal redistribution could have produced high levels of social cohesion without massive infrastructure. When these models gradually shifted toward more centralized forms, possibly due to climate change, population pressure, or shifts in trade networks, the final result became visible in the archaeological record. When the development of Sumer is placed within such a long process, the focus of analysis naturally shifts from speed to structure. What becomes most revealing is not the moment cities reached large scale, but the conditions that made new forms of management, memory, and social coordination necessary. It is within this context that methods of storing information begin to change in form. Systems based on memory, representative objects, or oral transmission gradually became insufficient for the needs of increasingly complex centers, and the first signs of information standardization start to appear in the archaeological record. The earliest clay tablets do not tell stories. They do not record myths or history. They are inventories, counts of barley, livestock, beer, labor, and ration distribution. This shows that writing emerged as an administrative tool, serving an economic system that had grown too complex to rely entirely on human memory. But if writing was needed to manage such a system, then that system must already have existed before symbols were standardized and pressed into clay. Long before cuneiform writing appeared, archaeology records the use of clay tokens as early as around 8,000 years before the Common Era. These small objects, spheres, cones, discs, are believed to have represented quantities and types of goods. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, these tokens were sealed inside clay envelopes known as buli, with impressions of their shapes pressed onto the surface. This sequence reveals a continuous process, from physical representations to impressed marks and finally to abstract symbols on tablets. Writing, in this sense, did not emerge from nothing, but as the final stage of a development that stretched across thousands of years. What is striking is that most pre-writing memory systems, such as knotted cords, markings on organic materials, or symbolic systems tied to ritual, have left almost no trace. Wood decays, textiles disintegrate, and oral traditions vanish entirely from the archaeological record. When historians rely only on what survives, it becomes easy to assign Sumer the role of the first, when in reality, Sumer may simply be the place where knowledge was first preserved in a material durable enough to reach the present day. Even the earliest forms of writing reveal hesitation and inconsistency. The initial signs lack clear syntactic order. Many symbols were used flexibly, and their readings remain debated well into the 20th century. This suggests that writing was not fully designed from the outset, but gradually adjusted through use. A tool like this is rarely the invention of a single moment. It is more often the result of prolonged experimentation across generations. It is also necessary to ask what writing does not record. Clay tablets mainly reflect the activities of temples and centralized distribution systems. The lives of most people, farmers, craftspeople, small households, have little direct voice in these early texts. If writing captures only a narrow slice of society, then using it as the starting point of history subtly shifts the balance. What was not written down is pushed into shadow, even if it may have existed for a very long time. From here, a broader issue comes into view. If writing is not an absolute beginning, but merely one step in a long sequence of memory technologies, then tying the entire idea of civilization to the moment writing appears may be an oversimplification. And if collective memory was once maintained through methods we can no longer access, then the knowledge foundations of Sumer may have rested on deeper, older layers. Layers that modern archaeology has only begun to touch at the surface. Once writing entered stable use, it did more than add a technical tool. It created new conditions under which power, labor, and resources could be observed, categorized, and reorganized. These changes did not occur all at once, but they left their clearest traces in spaces where record-keeping became necessary for managing society at large scale. From that point onward, the archaeological record increasingly reflects centralized forms of organization, while structures that did not depend on written documentation gradually become harder to recognize. The earliest texts speak almost exclusively about centers of power. They record what the temples owned, what was distributed, and who participated in those systems. Other forms of organization, such as family networks, village communities, or self-governing occupational groups, are largely absent. Not because they did not exist, but because they did not require writing in order to function. When history is written mainly by and for centralized institutions, informal structures gradually fade from the overall picture. This creates a paradox. The deeper we move into the Uruk and Jemdet Nasr periods, the more data we have, yet that data becomes increasingly one-sided. Power grows more visible because it leaves material traces, larger temples, larger storage facilities, denser records. At the same time, forms of social cooperation that do not rely on material accumulation, such as ritual obligation, seasonal sharing, or oral tradition, become invisible in the archaeological record. One important consequence is how we define social complexity. When complexity is measured by the number of texts, the scale of buildings, and the concentration of authority, pre-urban societies are easily labeled as simple. But complexity does not exist only in administrative form. A community can function effectively through unwritten rules, flexible roles, and collective memory sustained through ritual. These forms are difficult to measure, and so they are often underestimated. From this perspective, even the concept of the king in Sumer needs to be reconsidered. The king lists were compiled much later with clear political purposes, and they often extend the reigns of legendary figures by hundreds or even thousands of years. This reflects not only religious belief, but also an effort to reshape the past into a particular order of power. Before authority became personalized, Sumerian society may have operated through collective or rotating forms of leadership. Yet such models are not easily captured in official texts, and so they rarely survive in the written record. The concentration of power also feeds back into how we perceive the past. Once the state becomes the center, history begins to be told as a sequence of institutions, rather than as a web of diverse social interactions. Transitional phases, where older and newer forms of organization coexisted, are compressed or overlooked. This reinforces the impression that Sumer quickly reached a complete model of society, even though the reality may have been far more complex and internally contradictory. When the historical record is shaped mainly by what passes through centralized mechanisms, the inevitable result is that activities tied to those mechanisms stand out most clearly in the data. The texts that survive reflect above all the areas that required frequent and standardized record-keeping, especially the management of resources and labor. From this point onward, the picture of the Sumerian economy emerges with dense documentation at centers of power, while activities taking place outside official channels become increasingly difficult to recognize in the remaining evidence. The clay tablets reflect the economy of the center, not the economy of society as a whole. They tell us how much grain was distributed, but they rarely speak about how people produced, exchanged, and sustained themselves outside the official system. Household farming, local exchange, seasonal labor, and forms of mutual community support, which may have made up a large part of everyday economic life, are largely absent. When economic history is reconstructed mainly from administrative documents, activities that did not pass through temple control are easily treated as secondary or insignificant. This becomes especially important when we consider labor. In early Sumerian texts, labor is usually listed as a unit, numbers of people, numbers of days, numbers of rations. Presented this way, labor appears as a purely measurable resource, something that could be counted and distributed. Yet behind those numbers were human beings with daily rhythms, skills, and complex social relationships. These elements leave little trace on clay tablets, and as a result, they nearly vanish from the historical picture. We also need to consider economic activities that were materially fragile. Crafts based on wood, plant fibers, leather, or other perishable materials are rarely preserved. When production sites do leave clear traces, such as pottery kilns or metalworking areas, they are easily taken as representative of the entire economy. Meanwhile, other trades, even if they were more widespread, tend to be undervalued simply because they left no ruins behind. Long-distance trade in Sumer is often cited as evidence of advanced economic development. Texts from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era describe exchanges with regions such as Iran, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf. But this trade did not emerge from nothing. To sustain exchange networks across such distances, relationships and routes must have existed long before they were ever written down, possibly for centuries. When we see only what was recorded, the history of trade becomes shorter and simpler than it truly was. Another issue lies in how we interpret the idea of surplus. The presence of large storage facilities is often taken as proof of production beyond basic needs and of clear social stratification. Yet surplus does not serve only the accumulation of power. It can also be a survival strategy in an unstable environment where floods, droughts, and shifting river courses were frequent. In such conditions, centralized storage may reflect communal adaptation rather than top-down control. When economic activities are recorded mainly in forms that can be counted and redistributed, other aspects of social life must be approached through different kinds of evidence. In the case of Sumer, the surviving texts suggest that areas not directly tied to resource management only become clearly visible once they are absorbed into temple and power structures. As a result, the images of belief and worldview preserved in the historical record reflect primarily those forms that were standardized and institutionalized, rather than the full range of spiritual life that may once have existed. Before the gods were fully systematized, belief may have existed in far more flexible forms. Rituals tied to seasonal cycles, fertility, floods, and illness may have been practiced from a very early time, yet left no direct traces behind. As these beliefs gradually became connected to urban centers and temples, they began to be named, ranked, and linked to authority. What we read in written sources therefore reflects an official version of the worldview, not the full spectrum of beliefs that once existed. This becomes especially clear when we look at local diversity. Even within the same period, Sumerian cities honored different patron deities, each with its own rituals and traditions. The rise of certain gods was not driven by faith alone, but also by the economic and political position of their cities. As Uruk grew in power, Inanna became one of the most prominent goddesses. When Nippur held ritual centrality, Enlil was elevated to supreme status. These shifts show that belief was constantly being restructured through history, while older forms were absorbed or quietly forgotten. It is also important to notice the gap between ritual and everyday life. Religious texts tend to describe major ceremonies organized by the priesthood, often with direct state involvement. Personal belief, household faith, and protective practices, amulets, private prayers, healing rituals rarely appear. These practices may have been widespread and enduring, yet they did not fit easily into administrative record-keeping. When they were not written down, they gradually came to seem secondary in reconstructions of the Sumerian spiritual world. Even the myths that were recorded reveal signs of layering and adaptation. Stories of creation, floods, or divine journeys often survive in multiple versions, edited and reworked over time. This suggests that before being fixed in writing, these narratives circulated orally, changing with context and storyteller. Once they were written down, only certain versions were selected, while others disappeared entirely. From this perspective, Sumerian religion was not a complete system that appeared fully formed alongside writing. It was the result of a long process of narrowing and standardization. What we know today is what remained after that process. And if belief passed through so many layers of transformation, then the Sumerian worldview, how people understood time, nature, and their place in the cosmos, may once have been far more diverse than the official texts suggest. When systems of belief are approached mainly through written sources, the relationship between people and the natural world appears only indirectly. Yet it was physical conditions, the flow of rivers, the character of the soil, and shifts in climate that were present in daily life without interruption, whether they were recorded or not. Seen this way, the environment cannot be treated as a passive backdrop. It must be understood as a structural force, directly shaping social choices and defining the limits within which Sumerian society developed. Southern Mesopotamia was a landscape of constant change. From the 7th to the 4th millennium before the Common Era, the branches of the Tigris and Euphrates shifted repeatedly, creating seasonal wetlands, marshes, and new alluvial plains. These changes brought agricultural opportunity, but they also carried serious risks for survival. Barley and wheat farming depended on water control, yet controlling water required communal cooperation and knowledge accumulated across many generations. Such systems could not appear overnight, and were likely being tested long before the large canal networks recorded in the archaeological record. Climate change also played a significant role. Toward the end of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, the region experienced periods of aridity and unstable rainfall. Under these conditions, concentrating populations around reliable water sources became a survival strategy. Urbanization, therefore, may not have been driven only by social progress, but also by environmental pressure. When small communities were no longer flexible enough to cope with instability, pooling resources became a more viable option. Yet these adaptations are rarely reflected directly in texts. Clay tablets do not speak of failed floods, ruined harvests, or forced decisions to migrate. They record the outcomes of management, not the long process of trial and error that led to them. Looking back, we see a system that appears stable, while missing the many disruptions that compelled society to reshape itself from within. It is also important to note that the relationship between humans and the environment was not purely technical. Water, land, and weather held central places in Sumerian belief and symbolism. Deities associated with rivers, wisdom, and fertility reflect a deep dependence on natural cycles. This suggests that environmental knowledge was not only accumulated through practical experience, but also encoded in ritual and worldview, domains that archaeology can reach only indirectly. When the environment is treated as a historical agent, the story of Sumer begins to shift. Civilization no longer appears as a straight line of progress, but as a series of continuous responses to constantly changing conditions. Some solutions succeeded and left clear traces, others failed and vanished without a mark. What we call achievements may simply be the remnants of a harsh process of selection. When social systems are shaped through close interaction with the environment, their stability cannot be separated from the conditions that produce them. Changes in climate, river flow, or resource availability do not necessarily cause immediate collapse, but they can alter the rhythm and scale of society in ways that are difficult to detect in the archaeological record. It is precisely during these long periods of adjustment that familiar structures may contract, transform, or give way to other forms of organization, leaving far fewer traces than periods of expansion. Archaeology shows that the development of Sumerian cities did not follow a straight, uninterrupted path. At many sites, occupation layers are broken, thinner, or show signs of population contraction. These changes are often not dramatic enough to be labeled as a collapse, but they reflect periods in which society had to readjust its scale and structure. When cities shrank, many activities may have returned to more dispersed forms, leaving fewer traces for later generations to detect. A striking example appears toward the end of the late Uruk period, after roughly 3,200 years before the Common Era. In some regions, large centers lost prominence, while smaller settlements emerged or were reused. This pattern does not necessarily point to total failure. It may instead reflect flexible responses to environmental or economic pressure. Yet because these smaller communities did not build monumental architecture, their histories are far easier to overlook. Periods of contraction were often accompanied by changes in social organization. When central institutions could no longer maintain their previous level of control, authority may have dispersed back to local communities. Organizational forms that existed before urbanization could be reactivated, but because these forms left little in the way of administrative records, they are difficult to identify archaeologically. In such cases, history does not disappear, it simply becomes less visible. Another issue lies in how we label historical phases. Terms such as Uruk, Jemdet Nasr, or early dynastic were created to classify material remains, not to describe lived human experience. When transitional phases do not fit neatly into these categories, they are easily treated as anomalies or reduced to brief interruptions. This obscures long adjustment processes during which societies experimented with different models before stabilizing again. The role of collective memory also becomes crucial during periods of decline. When written records diminish or vanish entirely, historical memory may return to oral forms. Stories of earlier prosperity, floods, or upheaval could survive as myths or rituals, but when later texts were composed, these memories were often reshaped or woven into new frameworks, making their original context difficult to trace. If we accept that Sumer went through multiple cycles of expansion and contraction, the image of a civilization moving steadily forward no longer holds. Instead, we see a society constantly adapting, sometimes by abandoning structures that had once worked. These moments of retreat may have erased layers of knowledge and social organization, leaving behind a fragmented historical record. When many phases of transformation leave only faint material traces, our ability to recognize them depends directly on how we approach the past. At this point, the tools used to reconstruct history reveal their own influence. Not all forms of existence have equal chances of being recorded. What remains in the soil becomes the foundation for interpretation, while what leaves no material trace gradually slips out of view. The limits of the Sumerian historical record, therefore, do not reflect the loss caused by time alone, but also the structural limits of archaeology itself as a way of knowing the past. Most housing in southern Mesopotamia was built from sun-dried mud brick. While some large structures were rebuilt many times and left behind thick foundations, the majority of ordinary homes existed only briefly before being reused or eroded. Over thousands of years, many occupation layers blended together, making it difficult to distinguish clear boundaries between periods. When these layers blur, the everyday lives of tens of thousands of people are compressed into faint and fragmentary traces. Organic materials were even more likely to vanish. Wood, textiles, leather, rope, and tools made from plant matter had little chance of surviving in Mesopotamia's climate. This means that entire spheres of activity based on these materials, from light construction and transport to many crafts, can only be inferred indirectly. Without objects to display or date, these activities are easily treated as marginal, even though they may have been essential to social life. Even with more durable materials, preservation is selective. Pottery, clay tablets, and monumental buildings receive the most attention because they are easy to recognize and classify. Meanwhile, open spaces, like it's where communal life, informal exchange, or small-scale ritual took place, rarely leave clear traces. When archaeological maps are drawn from artifact concentrations, much of ancient lived space remains outside the frame. Another consequence of methodological limits lies in how we build chronologies. Dating based on pottery styles or architectural forms can create artificial gaps. When a style disappears from the record, it is often taken as a sign of interruption or replacement. In reality, change may have unfolded gradually, with older and newer forms coexisting for long periods. When intermediate forms are not preserved, history is cut into disconnected segments. Modern factors also shape where excavation is possible. Large areas of Mesopotamia now lie beneath deep sediment, modern cities, or are inaccessible due to political and environmental conditions. As a result, the picture of Sumer is built from a small number of sites excavated repeatedly, while other regions remain silent. When data clusters around a few centers, those centers are easily treated as representative of the entire civilization. These limitations do not diminish the value of archaeology, but they demand caution toward overly definitive conclusions. Each discovery is a slice, not a complete panorama. When slices are assembled, the gaps between them do not disappear. They are merely obscured by the smooth narrative we construct. When a significant portion of social life cannot be accessed directly through material remains, reconstructing the past inevitably depends on how the surviving data are selected, arranged, and interpreted. In the case of Sumer, this process does not occur in a neutral vacuum, but within historical frameworks shaped by modern scholarship. What is emphasized, what is simplified, and where Sumer is positioned within the broader flow of history, therefore reflects not only the character of ancient society, but also the ways in which successive generations of scholars have structured the story of the past. In European academic thought of the 19th and early 20th centuries, history was often told as a sequence of clear turning points, from hunting and gathering to agriculture, from villages to cities, from oral tradition to writing. With its early writing and clearly identifiable urban centers, Sumer became the perfect marker for that transition. Once such a marker was chosen, everything before it was easily compressed into a vague preparatory phase, while everything after it appeared as an inevitable outcome. This approach created a closed frame of interpretation. When Sumer was placed at the beginning of the timeline, research questions naturally revolved around clarifying that beginning rather than questioning the very idea of a beginning itself. Evidence that did not fit neatly, such as long continuities between pre-urban and urban phases, was often treated as an exception instead of being taken as a clue to a different historical model. Periodization further reinforced this sense of completeness. Phases like prehistory, Uruk, or early dynastic were presented as relatively distinct units, with boundaries drawn according to changes in material culture, yet these boundaries were research tools, not lived realities. When they were used to narrate history, they created the impression that societies changed in discrete blocks rather than through overlapping and extended processes. It is also important to remember that many foundational Sumerian texts were translated and interpreted at a time when academic methods and interdisciplinary comparison were still limited. Early interpretations, once absorbed into textbooks and popular accounts, continued to shape public understanding, even as later research introduced more nuanced perspectives. This intellectual inertia made the image of Sumer stable and familiar, but also difficult to revise. Storytelling itself plays a role. To be communicated, history often needs a clear narrative arc with a beginning, a climax, and an outcome. Sumer fits perfectly as the first chapter in the story of civilization. Yet the demand for a coherent story can blur what does not align. Slow processes without clear peaks, or periods in which society did not advance along familiar paths. Once we recognize that the image of Sumer is shaped not only by data but also by interpretation, a new space for inquiry opens up. The question is no longer simply how to find more artifacts or texts, but how to re-examine the underlying assumptions that guide our questions. If the modern framework itself contributes to the sense of completeness, then loosening that framework allows gaps to be seen not as failures of evidence, but as signs of a more complex and unfinished history. Because the narrative of Sumer has been shaped within a particular historical framework, expanding the field of view becomes essential for reassessing how exceptional this case truly is. Placing Sumer alongside other regions of the ancient Near East reveals parallel developments unfolding at the same time, even if they differed in form or in how well they were preserved. From this comparative perspective, the central position often assigned to Sumer no longer appears fixed. Instead, it becomes one among several possible historical configurations, visible or dominant depending on the type of evidence considered and criteria used to define significance. In Anatolia and the Levant, stable agricultural communities emerged as early as the 10th millennium before the Common Era. Sites such as Çatalhöyük, dated to roughly 7,500 to 5,700 years before the Common Era, reveal high population density, complex architecture, and shared ritual life, even in the absence of writing or a centralized state in the classical sense. Because these societies did not develop into cities with formal administrative systems, they are often placed outside the narrative of civilization, despite their high level of social organization. In the Nile Valley, processes of population concentration and ritual integration also began very early, long before the unification of Egypt around 3,100 years before the Common Era. Evidence for agricultural management, social stratification, and symbolic authority appears from the 4th millennium before the Common Era, yet it is usually labeled as pre-dynastic, a term that implies incompleteness. This naming reflects an expectation of a particular developmental model, in which only societies that reach a specific form of statehood are considered to have truly begun. Even within Mesopotamia itself, regional diversity is often obscured by the focus on the south. Northern Mesopotamia, with centers such as Tel Brak and Hamukkar, shows signs of urbanization and large-scale conflict by the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. These processes unfolded with a degree of independence, suggesting that urbanization was not a single path radiating from Sumer, but a broader response to similar economic and environmental conditions. Cross-regional comparison also raises questions about the criteria used to define civilization. If writing and large cities are treated as mandatory conditions, Sumer easily occupies the first position. But if the criteria expand to include complex social organization, shared ritual systems, resource management, and exchange networks, then many other societies, even those that left no writing behind, reached significant levels of development at a very early stage. The choice of criteria, therefore, directly shapes the story we tell. Another consequence of comparison is an awareness of asynchrony. Different regions did not wait for Sumer to develop, nor did they follow the same trajectory. Some areas reached high social complexity without strong urbanization. Others formed cities, but did not sustain them for long. When history is told from the perspective of a single center, these alternative paths are treated as dead ends rather than as valid social experiments. From this viewpoint, Sumer can be understood as a case in which multiple factors, environment, economy, and record-keeping technologies converged in a way that produced particularly clear and durable traces. But that convergence does not mean other societies were less developed. It reflects differences in how knowledge and organization were materialized. Paths that did not lead to writing or monumental architecture may have been passed over by history, even though they existed alongside one another and influenced each other. Shifting the analytical focus in this way leads to an important consequence. The concept of heritage can no longer be understood as a straight line of transmission from a single center. When historical traces are seen as products of preservation and reception rather than of isolated societies, elements often labeled as uniquely Sumerian must be reconsidered within a wider field of interaction. It is within this broader context that phenomena such as writing, urban organization, and symbolic systems begin to appear not as inventions created at a single point, but as configurations formed through prolonged contact, selection, and accumulation across multiple traditions. From the Uruk period onward, material evidence already shows that Sumer did not exist in isolation. Precious stones from Iran, timber from the Zagros Mountains, metals from Anatolia, and shells from the Persian Gulf appear in the archaeological layers of southern Mesopotamia by the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. These exchange networks carried more than goods. They moved skills, symbols, and social practices. As these elements blended into local contexts, the boundary between what was Sumerian and what was external became increasingly blurred. Cuneiform writing, often seen as Sumer's most distinctive invention, was not immune to this interaction. The system of signs was quickly adopted and adapted by communities speaking other languages. By the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, cuneiform was being used to record Akkadian, a Semitic language with a very different structure. This was not simply a one-way transmission from Sumer to Akkad, it was a mutual reshaping. Writing changed to accommodate a new language, and new modes of record-keeping in turn influenced administrative and legal thinking. A similar process unfolded in religion and mythology. Sumerian gods did not disappear as other communities rose to prominence. They were identified with, renamed, or given new attributes. Stories of creation, floods, and divine authority existed in multiple forms, reflecting centuries of accumulation and revision. When later texts recorded these narratives, they captured traditions filtered through many cultural layers, rather than a single, pristine moment. Even urban models reveal this hybridity. Sumerian cities were shaped by earlier settlement traditions, and they also influenced neighboring regions in return. When new centers emerged in northern Mesopotamia or farther afield, they did not simply copy Sumer, they selected and adapted elements that fit local conditions. In this sense, heritage was not a complete package passed along intact, but a set of ideas continuously reconfigured. Seeing Sumer as a crossroads rather than as an absolute point of origin changes how its influence is understood. What endured and left traces was not necessarily the product of a single civilization, but the outcome of prolonged interaction among many communities. When history is told this way, the notion of civilizational ownership no longer holds. Once the idea of a pure origin becomes difficult to sustain, the focus of analysis inevitably shifts from identifying a starting point to examining the actors involved in the process of formation. In the case of Sumer, attention turns toward the communities that created and maintained the social structures visible in the archaeological record. Yet even at the level of people and identity, what appears clear in naming and classification quickly reveals its uncertainty. The question of who the Sumerians were proves to be no less complex than the question of the legacy they left behind. The Sumerian language is a special case. It does not belong to any known language family and has no confirmed direct relatives. This very sense of isolation led to many hypotheses throughout the 20th century, from the idea that the Sumerians were a distant migrant group arriving in Mesopotamia, to the possibility that they were descendants of local communities who developed their own language over a long period of time. To this day, there is no linguistic evidence strong enough to support a definitive conclusion in either direction. The greatest difficulty lies in one simple fact. Language only becomes visible once it is written. Before roughly 3,300 years before the Common Era, we have no Sumerian texts and therefore no certainty about what languages were spoken in southern Mesopotamia during the many millennia before that. Sumerian may have existed for a very long time, but it may also have been just one of several languages used in the region, gradually becoming dominant as it became tied to administration and power. The question of population follows a similar pattern. Archaeology shows continuity in settlement patterns and material culture from the Ubaid period into Uruk, but continuity does not necessarily mean that a single, unchanged group of people remained in place. River regions are natural meeting points for both short-term and long-term migration. Different groups arriving, mixing, and gradually sharing social practices is entirely plausible, yet extremely difficult to trace without sufficient biological data. Studies of ancient human remains in Mesopotamia face serious limitations due to poor preservation conditions and small sample sizes. This makes any reconstruction of the genetic history of Sumer's population highly uncertain. In the absence of solid biological evidence, theories about population origins often rely on language and material culture, fields that are themselves deeply shaped by interaction and cultural exchange. Another revealing point lies in how the Sumerians referred to themselves in texts. The term, commonly translated as Sumerian, does not necessarily reflect an ethnic identity in the modern sense. It may have functioned simply as a linguistic or geographic distinction within an administrative context. As different communities used cuneiform writing, the boundary between us and them may have been far more fluid than modern categories suggest. If we accept that we cannot determine the origins or identity of the Sumerians with modern precision, this does not weaken their history. On the contrary, it highlights an essential reality. Ancient societies were often formed through long processes of mixture, not through the sudden appearance of a single homogeneous group. In this sense, Sumer may have been the result of multiple populations, languages, and traditions converging at a favorable moment. When human identity is understood as something constantly in motion, what people create can no longer be seen as stable or accumulated along a single line. Systems of knowledge, skills, and social organization are closely tied to specific conditions, environment, population scale, and power structures, and are therefore prone to adjustment or disruption when those conditions change. In such a context, the assumption that ancient knowledge was always transmitted continuously and intact becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. It invites us to approach history not only through what was preserved, but also through what was transformed, fragmented, or lost over time. Writing, despite being a major step forward, did not guarantee the preservation of all knowledge. In reality, most surviving Sumerian texts are administrative, legal, or ritual in nature. Fields such as detailed farming practices, informal construction techniques, folk medicine, or deep knowledge of local environments were rarely systematized in writing. They existed as lived practices, passed from person to person, and were therefore vulnerable to disruption whenever communities were unsettled. When urban centers weakened or were restructured, these chains of transmission could easily break. A complex irrigation system, for example, required not only physical infrastructure, but also knowledge of timing, water flow, and maintenance. If the labor force changed, or if shifts in power made upkeep a lower priority, such subtle knowledge could disappear within just a few generations, even if the canals themselves remained etched into the landscape. Even in areas that were written down, the stability of knowledge was never assured. Texts require readers, scribes, and shared contexts in order to be understood correctly. When languages changed, or when writing systems were adapted for new purposes, original meanings could fade. This became especially clear in later periods, when Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian in daily life. While Sumerian survived mainly as a scholarly and ritual language, in this transition knowledge could be preserved in form yet lose its vitality. Another layer of fragility lies in the fact that knowledge is often tied to place. Understanding specific soils, water sources, and local climate conditions does not transfer easily to new environments. When populations moved or when natural conditions shifted, such localized knowledge could become obsolete and be abandoned. What remains visible in the historical record are more generalized systems, while the most refined and situational insights quietly vanish. The role of power in knowledge preservation must also be considered. Knowledge that supported administration, taxation, and official ritual had a far greater chance of being recorded and maintained. By contrast, forms of knowledge that did not directly reinforce the existing order were more easily dismissed as secondary. When history is written through institutions, this selective process distorts the picture of ancient knowledge, highlighting certain domains while obscuring others. Seen through this lens, Sumerian civilization no longer appears as a steadily accumulating archive of knowledge, but as an unstable flow in which understanding was created, adjusted, and sometimes lost. What we call achievements may represent only the surviving fraction of a much larger body of knowledge that once existed. If so, judging the level of progress in Sumer, or in any ancient society, solely by what remains risks producing incomplete conclusions. When the survival of knowledge depends on conditions beyond human intention, the fact that some traces endure while others disappear cannot be explained simply by their inherent value. These differences reflect the extent to which material circumstances and historical context allowed certain forms of record to outlast others. From this perspective, the past we can access today is not the full sum of what once occurred, but what remains after a long process of selection, a process in which time itself played the decisive role. Clay tablets survived so well in Mesopotamian conditions not because the Sumerians anticipated their future historical value, but because clay, when accidentally fired in a blaze or buried under the right conditions, becomes remarkably durable. By contrast, records written on wood, leather, or cloth, if they ever existed, have almost certainly vanished. As a result, Sumerian history is heavily shaped by what happened to be written on clay, while entire domains that relied on other materials were erased by time. Chance also plays a role in which cities are studied most intensively. Uruk, Ur, and Nippur became central to research not only because of their historical importance, but because they were accessible and excavated early. Other sites, excavated less often or destroyed by modern activity, have little voice in the broader narrative. When evidence comes primarily from a handful of locations, history is inevitably written from their perspective. Time does not only erase, it also rearranges. Occupation layers overlap, objects are displaced, and original contexts are disturbed, making it difficult to reconstruct sequences of events. What we call a period is often the result of reordering fragments, not a faithful reflection of how ancient societies experienced time. Fragments that fit the overarching narrative tend to be placed at the center, while those that do not are more easily set aside. This selective survival also shapes how importance is judged. An innovation may be considered pivotal simply because it left abundant traces, while other changes, and perhaps just as influential in daily life, go unrecognized because they left little behind. This creates a kind of survival bias. What remains is assumed to have mattered most, while what mattered but did not endure is forgotten. Recognizing the role of chance does not weaken the history of Sumer, it makes it more modest. Instead of treating the current picture as complete, we begin to see it as an unfinished manuscript, with passages missing or rewritten by time. Each new discovery does not merely add information but has the potential to change how what we already know is understood. From this perspective, the question is no longer whether Sumer was truly the first, but how many other societies may have reached comparable levels of complexity without leaving durable traces. If history is shaped by such harsh selection, then assigning Sumer a special position may tell us more about what survived than about the full range of ancient human development. In contemporary scholarship, attention is therefore shifting away from simply hunting for missing pieces toward examining the assumptions that guide research itself. Rather than treating gaps in the record as temporary problems to be solved, more studies approach them as structural consequences of how history is formed and preserved. This shift does not mean abandoning the effort to reconstruct the past. It means adjusting our expectations about how complete any historical picture can ever be, and accepting that uncertainty is not a failure of knowledge, but part of what it means to study deep time. Rather than asking where did Sumer begin, recent research has shifted toward asking how did Sumer take shape, through how many layers, and over how long a span of time. The change may seem subtle, but its implications are profound. It allows history to be understood as an open process in which phases overlap and multiple forms of organization coexist, rather than as a sequence of sharply defined milestones. Within this perspective, gaps are no longer failures of evidence, but signs of complexity that cannot be reduced. This shift in questioning also weakens the pull of searching for a pure origin. When there is no longer an expectation of finding a single starting moment, research can focus instead on relationships between people and environment, between different communities, between material and non-material forms of knowledge. These relationships are harder to measure, but they more accurately reflect how ancient societies actually functioned. The change in mindset is also visible in method. Archaeology increasingly works alongside geology, climate science, biology, and data modeling. These approaches are not meant to retell history in a new linear order, but to clarify how uncertain our knowledge truly is. When models show that multiple scenarios can fit the same data, absolute certainty is no longer a realistic goal. More importantly, this way of asking questions forces us to accept that history does not always serve the storytelling needs of the present. A society may not leave behind a neat narrative. It may exist as a web of intertwined processes without clear climaxes or turning points. When Sumer is studied in this spirit, what was once dismissed as vague or insufficient evidence begins to be treated as areas requiring careful attention rather than omission. This approach also creates space for scholarly humility. Acknowledging that we may never fully know Sumer does not diminish the value of research, it makes it more honest. Every conclusion becomes provisional, open to revision as new data emerge or as theoretical frameworks change. From here, the role of the historian shifts as well. Instead of presenting the past as a sequence of answers, history becomes an ongoing dialogue in which the most important questions do not always have solutions. And if Sumer is understood in this way, its greatest significance may lie not in being the first civilization, but in forcing us to rethink how we define, study, and narrate the very idea of civilization. As research moves from academic circles into public communication, complex findings are often simplified to fit educational and media frameworks. Standardizing content around clear milestones and familiar concepts makes history more accessible, but it also reduces the ability to convey the uncertainty inherent in serious scholarship. In the case of Sumer, this simplification has helped produce a stable and familiar image, one in which the gaps in the historical record are rarely acknowledged in popular understanding. In general education, the need to systematize knowledge often forces a choice of clear markers and representative concepts. When Sumer is selected as a starting point, the historical narrative becomes more linear and easier to follow. Yet this clarity comes at a cost. Transitional periods, societies without writing, and developmental paths that did not lead to strong urbanization gradually disappear from shared awareness. History, in this form, becomes a sequence of achievements rather than a web of experimentation and adaptation. Popular media reinforces this image as well. Headlines that emphasize the first, the origin, or where everything began attract attention, but they rarely reflect a level of debate within academic research. When new discoveries are reported, they are often fitted into the familiar framework instead of being used to challenge it. This creates a feedback loop. The established image of Sumer is repeated, grows more solid over time, and alternative interpretations struggle to reach a wider audience. One long-term consequence of this way of telling history is the creation of unrealistic expectations about the past. When history is presented as a series of clear advances, gaps and contradictions are treated as problems to be solved rather than as inherent features of studying deep time. This can lead to frustration or skepticism when the public encounters research that offers no definitive answers. In that environment, simple or sensational explanations can sometimes feel more appealing than careful, nuanced analysis. It is also important to recognize that how we tell history shapes how we understand the present. When civilization is tied to a single point of origin, other societies, both past and present, are easily judged through an unfair comparative lens. Developmental paths that did not lead toward the familiar city-state model are seen as slow or incomplete. Sumer unintentionally becomes the standard against which all forms of social complexity are measured. From this perspective, the issue is not only whether Sumer is fully understood, but how the story we tell about Sumer shapes the way we think about human history as a whole. When the narrative is simplified for ease of transmission, it loses the ability to reflect the diversity and uncertainty that lie at the heart of the past. Reintroducing that uncertainty does not make history harder to understand, it makes it more honest. In this context, the focus shifts from evaluating historical content alone to examining how history is presented. The need for clarity in education cannot be separated from the responsibility to remain truthful to the limits of what is known. Rather than searching for a new story by simply adding more data or detail, a more meaningful approach lies in adjusting how the story is told. This means allowing limits, gaps, and incompleteness to become visible parts of what is communicated, not elements hidden beneath a smooth and confident narrative. Only then can history move closer to what it truly is, not a finished account, but an ongoing effort to understand a past that was always more complex than any single story can capture. One approach that is gaining increasing attention is to tell history as an ongoing process, rather than as a series of fixed conclusions. In this kind of narrative, Sumer is no longer a first chapter that has already closed, but a collection of open questions, the formation of cities, the standardization of knowledge, the fragility of social memory. When history is presented this way, the audience is not only given information but invited to take part in the act of questioning itself. This approach requires a change in tone. Instead of speaking with absolute certainty, the historian needs to make the degree of uncertainty behind each conclusion visible. This does not weaken knowledge. It helps listeners understand that historical research operates through probability, comparison, and constant revision. When limits are stated openly, trust does not diminish. It becomes more grounded. Another crucial element is bringing the gaps into the story itself. Rather than treating them as flaws, these gaps can be shown as inseparable from the study of the ancient past. In the case of Sumer, acknowledging how much we do not know, from population origins to the scale of lost knowledge, helps people see that history is not a complete archive, but a continuous process of reconstruction. This way of telling history also allows multiple perspectives to coexist. Sumer can be presented at once as a major center of innovation and as a product of regional interaction, as the place where writing was standardized and as a place where many other forms of knowledge were obscured. When these perspectives do not cancel each other out, history gains depth and comes closer to the complex reality of the past. Most importantly, this approach helps avoid two common extremes. On one side is mythologization, which treats Sumer as the origin of everything. On the other is radical skepticism, which dismisses the value of what we know. Between these extremes, history can exist as a space of dialogue where hypotheses are weighed and limitations are respected. When Sumer is told in this way, its value does not lie in providing final answers, but in illustrating how history itself works, slowly, incompletely, and always shaped by both evidence and the ways we interpret that evidence. And if Sumer can be understood as a clear example of this unfinished process, it can also serve as a starting point for a broader approach to history, one in which the most important question is not what happened, but how do we know this, and what can we never fully know? From this perspective, the focus no longer rests on summarizing individual issues that have been raised, but on clarifying their methodological consequences. When Sumer is treated as a case where knowledge is always provisional and incomplete, its limits stop appearing as exceptional. Instead, they expand into a broader issue for historical study itself. The extent to which any past society can ever be fully understood, especially when even the civilizations that left the richest records still reveal gaps that cannot be overcome. In this context, history no longer appears as a storehouse of fixed events, but as a process of understanding that is constantly in motion. Each generation of scholars does more than add new data. It brings new questions, new priorities, and new limits. What was once considered central may shift to the margins, while what was once overlooked may become decisive. Sumer, in this sense, is not only an object of study, but a clear demonstration of history's dynamic nature. This perspective also forces us to reconsider the relationship between evidence and interpretation. Evidence does not speak on its own. It becomes meaningful only when placed within a framework of understanding. When that framework changes, the meaning of the evidence changes with it. A clay tablet once read as proof of absolute centralized power may, under a different lens, reflect a temporary response to crisis. The evidence itself has not changed, so the questions we ask of it have. The incompleteness of knowledge also sets limits on sweeping generalizations. When we speak of the rise of civilization, we often unconsciously search for universal traits and shared sequences, yet Sumer shows that societies can reach high levels of complexity through very different paths, and those paths do not necessarily converge on a single model. Generalizing too quickly not only erases diversity, but weakens our ability to learn from the past. At a deeper level, the story of Sumer raises questions about the relationship between knowledge and humility. Acknowledging that we cannot know everything is not a sign of scholarly failure, but the foundation of a sustainable research attitude. When history is approached in this spirit, each new discovery is not a final piece of the puzzle, but a reminder that the picture remains unfinished. This humility is especially important in the modern world, where science and technology often create the sense that everything can be measured and explained. Sumer reminds us that there are limits that cannot be crossed. Materials have vanished, memories have broken, and lived experiences were never recorded. History, therefore, is not only the story of what happened, but also the story of what can no longer be known. Seen this way, the greatest value of studying Sumer does not lie in deciding whether it was truly the first. Its value lies in forcing us to confront the incomplete nature of historical knowledge itself. It exposes the assumptions we carry when we look at the past, and opens the possibility of adjusting those assumptions with greater flexibility. From this viewpoint, attention no longer turns toward closing the arguments that have been presented, but toward recognizing our role as participants in the ongoing construction of history. When history is acknowledged as perpetually unfinished, the goal of research and narration cannot be the delivery of definitive conclusions. Instead, it calls for a responsible scholarly attitude, maintaining openness in interpretation, remaining honest about the limits of the evidence, and staying aware of how the act of telling history shapes our understanding of the past. Sumer is an especially clear example of this problem. For more than a century, it has been used as a reference point to explain the emergence of civilization, as if everything that followed could be traced back to a single beginning. Yet when we look across all that has been examined, environment, economy, belief, writing, knowledge, and the ways history itself is selected and told, one thing becomes clear: Sumer is not an answer but a question that stretches across time. Continuing to tell Sumer as a closed story may offer reassurance, but it comes at the cost of simplification. When history is presented as a clean sequence of achievements, we easily forget that most human life leaves no durable trace. What remains, clay tablets, brick walls, royal names, represents only a small fraction of the reality that once existed. The responsibility of the storyteller is to remind the listener of what lies beyond those remnants, even when it cannot be fully described. This does not mean denying the value of what we know. On the contrary, it calls for deeper respect for the evidence itself. Every artifact and every text must be considered alongside what is absent. When a record survives, we must ask how many similar activities went unrecorded. When a monumental structure is excavated, we must remember the thousands of modest living spaces that disappeared without leaving a trace. Ending a historical narrative, therefore, is not about closing questions, but about placing them correctly within our understanding. With Sumer, that place is not at the beginning of a straight, evolutionary line, but at an intersection, where many long-term processes became visible enough for us to notice them, while simultaneously obscuring what unfolded beyond that field of view. When history is told this way, the listener does more than absorb information. They are invited into a way of thinking, measured skepticism, responsible curiosity, and humility before the past. Sumer then ceases to be a symbol of certainty and becomes a reminder that human knowledge is always built upon what has been lost. At this point, continuing the argument no longer serves to add more data or propose new interpretations. What has already been presented is enough to show that the history of Sumer cannot be approached as a story with a fixed conclusion, but as a structure that constantly reveals its own limit. Stopping here does not mean closure. It marks a transition from analysis to reflection, from what can be established to an awareness of the vast territory that remains beyond the reach of history. Perhaps Sumer was never meant to become the first civilization in any absolute sense. Perhaps it was simply the place where time, materials, and circumstance allowed certain traces to survive longer than elsewhere. Seen this way, Sumer does not lose its value. It becomes more human. It is no longer a symbol of a perfect beginning, but a testament to how people lived, adapted, remembered, and forgot in a world that was always in motion. History, in this light, is not a straight road leading from point A to point B. It is a layered network of social experiments, of knowledge created and then lost, of structures that worked for a time and then no longer did. What reaches us today is not what was most important, but what was most fortunate. Recognizing this does not make history fragile. It makes the study of history more honest. In the modern world, where we often seek certainty and clear conclusions, Sumer offers a different lesson. It reminds us that understanding always comes with limits, and that humility is not a weakness of knowledge, but the condition that allows knowledge to keep growing. When we accept that not every question has a complete answer, history opens up as a space for reflection rather than a collection of fixed statements. In that spirit, this episode of Bedtime History is not meant to change what you know about Sumer, but to invite you to look at it at a slower pace, the pace of questions that remain open, the pace of gaps that do not need to be rushed, closed, and the pace of a past that continues to speak with the present if we are willing to listen. In the next video of Bedtime History, we will continue to expand this approach, not to search for a final answer to history, but to move further into the edges of knowledge, where what remains unsaid often reveals the most about the people and the world they once inhabited.